Dan Murray was a name that echoed through the halls of basketball history. At 6 feet 8 inches, with a wingspan that seemed to stretch forever, he was a force of nature on the court. Drafted straight out of college, he became one of the most celebrated players in the NBA, known for his clutch three-pointers and his ability to rally his team from the brink of defeat. By the time he retired at 32, he had 2 championship rings, a legacy of leadership, and a reputation as one of the most disciplined athletes in the game. But off the court, Dan was searching for something more, something that would give his life meaning beyond the roar of the crowd and the glint of trophies. It was during a charity event in Los Angeles that he first met Sherry. She was a fitness instructor, radiant and full of life, with a smile that could light up the Staples Center. Sherry had always been passionate about health and wellness, and her energy was magnetic. Dan, usually reserved and focused, found himself drawn to her warmth and authenticity. They talked for hours at night, laughing about their shared love for sports and their dreams of future. For Dan, it was a rare moment of vulnerability. For Sherry, it was the beginning of something she hadn't expected. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Dan, used to the fast-paced life of an athlete, was surprised by how quickly Sherry became his anchor. She was his biggest supporter, attending every game she could, cheering him on with fervor that matched his own passion for the sport. Sherry, in turn, found in Dan a man who was not just a star, but someone deeply committed to his values and his family. They balanced each other perfectly. Her spontaneity and his discipline, her warmth and his intensity. Within a year, Dan proposed during a quiet getaway in Napa Valley. It was a simple yet profound moment, under a canopy of stars, far from the cameras and the crowds. Sherry said yes without hesitation, and they married in an intimate ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. It was the start of a life they both believed would be filled with love, success, and endless possibilities. The early years of their marriage were a blend of adventure and stability. Dan transitioned smoothly into retirement, investing his earnings into real estate and business ventures. Sherry continued her work as a fitness instructor, but her focus shifted to creating a home for them. They bought a sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills, a symbol of their success and a space where they could grow their family. Their first child, Cameron, was born 2 years into their marriage. He was a carbon copy of Dan, with the same sharp features and a natural affinity for sports. 2 years later, Camille arrived, a spirited little girl who inherited Sherry's bright smile and boundless energy. The Moyes were the picture of a perfect family, successful, loving, and deeply connected. But life wasn't without its challenges. Dan's drive to succeed in business sometimes kept him away from home, while Sherry juggled the demands of motherhood and her career. They worked hard to maintain their connection, scheduling date nights and family vacations to keep the spark alive. For a while, it was enough. Yet, as the years passed, the routines of their life began to feel monotonous. The passion that had once defined their relationship started to fade, replaced by the quiet comfort of familiarity. They still loved each other deeply, but the fire that had once burned so brightly was now a steady, unremarkable flame. If you want to know how this famous player was fooled by her cheating wife, stay until the end. Please subscribe if you like our stories. It helps us a lot. Thanks. By the time they celebrated their 10th anniversary, Dan and Sherry had settled into a rhythm that worked for them. Dan was busy with his real estate ventures, often traveling for meetings and deals. Sherry, now a full-time homemaker, devoted herself to raising Cameron and Camila while occasionally teaching fitness classes at a local gym. They were a team, but the distance between them was growing, even if neither wanted to admit it. Dan's 40th birthday was approaching, and Sherry wanted to make it special. She saw it as an opportunity to reignite the spark between them, to remind Dan of the life they had built together. She began planning an extravagant party, inviting friends, family, and even some of Dan's former teammates. It was her way of showing him how much he meant to her, even if she wasn't sure he noticed anymore. Meanwhile, Dan was preoccupied with a major business deal, a multi-million-dollar investment that could define his post-basketball career. He spent long hours on the phone, buried in paperwork, and often came home late, too tired to do more than kiss Sherry goodnight. He loved his family, but the weight of his ambitions sometimes made it hard to be present. Unbeknownst to Dan, Sherry was feeling the strain of their routine. She missed the excitement of their early years, the passion that had once defined their relationship. She poured herself into planning Dan's party, hoping it would bring them closer. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The Murray household was a well-oiled machine, each member playing their part. Dan's morning started early, with a workout in their home gym, followed by a series of conference calls. Sherry, meanwhile, got Cameron and Camila ready for school, packing lunches and signing permission slips with the efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. After dropping the kids off, Sherry headed to the gym where she taught a morning yoga class. It was her escape, a place where she could focus on herself and forget, even for a moment, the weight of her responsibilities. Dan, on the other hand, spent his days in meetings, negotiating deals and managing his growing portfolio of properties. In the evenings, they came together as a family. Dinner was a sacred time, a chance to catch up and share stories from their day. Cameron was obsessed with basketball, just like his dad, while Camila was more interested in dance and art. Dan and Sherry made an effort to be present, to listen and engage, but the exhaustion of their daily lives often left them drained. Weekends were for family outings, trips to the beach, hikes in the hills, or simply lounging by the pool. But even these moments of togetherness felt tinged with routine. Dan and Sherry were going through the motions, their connection fraying at the edges. Sherry's plan for Dan's 40th birthday party was ambitious. She wanted it to be a night to remember, a celebration of everything he had accomplished and everything they had built together. She hired Matthew, a renowned event planner, to help bring her vision to life. Matthew was charming and attentive, with a knack for understanding exactly what his clients wanted. He and Sherry spent hours together, brainstorming ideas and refining details. They laughed easily, their conversations flowing as if they had known each other for years. Sherry found herself looking forward to their meetings, a welcome break from the monotony of her daily life. Dan, meanwhile, was too busy to notice the time Sherry was spending with Matthew. He trusted her completely, focused instead on closing his latest deal. He knew the party was important to her, but he didn't realize how much of herself she was pouring into it. As the day of the party approached, Sherry felt a growing sense of anticipation. She was excited to see Dan's reaction, to remind him of the life they had built together. But she couldn't ignore the flutter of excitement she felt whenever Matthew was around. Matthew's presence in Sherry's life became a constant source of excitement. Their meetings, initially focused on the party, began to stretch longer as their conversations drifted into more personal territory. Matthew had a way of making Sherry feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. He complimented her ideas, laughed at her jokes, and listened intently when she spoke about her frustrations and dreams. It was intoxicating, and Sherry found herself looking forward to their time together more than she cared to admit. One evening, after a particularly long day of planning, Matthew suggested they grab a drink to unwind. Sherry hesitated, knowing she should go home to Dan and the kids, but the temptation was too strong. They ended up at a cozy wine bar, the kind of place Sherry hadn't been to in years. The atmosphere was intimate, the dim lighting casting a warm glow over their table. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Matthew shared stories of his travels and his passion for creating unforgettable events, while Sherry opened up about the monotony of her daily life and the distance she felt from Dan. As the night wore on, the wine loosened their inhibitions. Matthew reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. Sherry felt a jolt of electricity, a spark she hadn't felt in years. She knew she should pull away, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned into the moment, letting herself be swept up in the excitement of it all. When Matthew suggested they continue the conversation somewhere more private, Sherry's heart raced. She knew it was wrong, but the pull was irresistible. That night, Sherry crossed a line she never thought she would. It was reckless and impulsive. Everything her life with Dan wasn't. As she lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, guilt gnawed at her. She told herself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. For the first time in years, she felt alive. The night of Dan's 40th birthday party arrived, and the mansion was transformed into a glittering wonderland. Sherry had poured her heart into every detail, from the elegant decor to the carefully curated guest list. Dan was overwhelmed by the effort she had put into the event, pulling her into a tight embrace and whispering how much he loved her. For a moment, Sherry felt a flicker of connection they had once shared, but was quickly overshadowed by the guilt weighing heavily on her chest. As the party unfolded, Sherry couldn't shake the tension that had been building inside her. Matthew was there, as professional as ever, but the air between them was charged with unspoken words. Sherry avoided him as much as she could, focusing instead on playing the role of the perfect hostess. But when Matthew sent her a text suggesting they meet in his car, Sherry's resolve wavered. She knew it was wrong, but the pull was too strong. Dan, meanwhile, had noticed Sherry's absence. When he checked her location and saw she was outside the mansion, a sense of dread washed over him. He followed the signal, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and anger. What he found shattered him. Sherry and Matthew, locked in a passionate embrace. The world seemed to stop as Dan's rage erupted. He lunged at Matthew, his fists flying as years of trust and love crumbled in an instant. The party descended into chaos as guests rushed to intervene. Sherry stood frozen, her face pale with shock and shame. Dan's voice echoed through the night, raw with pain and betrayal. The life they had built together was unraveling before her eyes, and there was no going back. The aftermath of the party was a whirlwind of pain and humiliation. Dan's outburst had left Matthew bruised and bloodied, but the real damage was to the Murray family. News of the scandal spread like wildfire, fueled by Dan's fame and the sheer spectacle of it all. Headlines screamed about the fall of the basketball legend, and social media was ablaze with speculation and judgment. Dan, once celebrated for his discipline and integrity, now found his legacy tarnished by the very public unraveling of his marriage. Sherry was devastated. The guilt she had been carrying since that night with Matthew now consumed her. She tried to explain, to apologize, but Dan was beyond reach. His trust had been shattered, and the love they had built over a decade felt like a distant memory. The mansion that had once been their sanctuary now felt like a prison, filled with silence and resentment. The divorce was inevitable. Dan and Sherry fought bitterly over custody of Cameron and Camila, their once united front now fractured beyond repair. In the end, Dan took custody of Cameron, while Sherry kept Camila. The siblings, once inseparable, were now divided, their lives shaped by the fallout of their parents' choices. As Sherry packed her things and prepared to leave the mansion, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her mistakes. She had lost everything, her family, her home, and the man she had once loved more than anything. The life she had built was gone, and all that remained was the crushing reality of her choices. In the years that followed, Dan and Sherry's lives took dramatically different paths. Dan threw himself into his work, using his business ventures as a way to rebuild his sense of purpose. He focused on being the best father he could be to Cameron, coaching his son's basketball team and spending as much time with him as possible. Though the scandal had left a stain on his legacy, Dan found solace in the quiet moments with his son, who idolized him despite everything. Cameron grew into a talented athlete, much like his father, but he carried the weight of his parents' divorce with him. He struggled to understand how the family he had once known could fall apart so completely. Dan did his best to shield him from the worst of it, but the scars were there hidden beneath the surface. Sherry, on the other hand, struggled to rebuild her life. She moved into a small apartment with Camila, trying to create a sense of stability for her daughter. But the guilt and regret never left her. She tried to reconnect with Camila, but the little girl was distant, her trust in her mother shaken by the upheaval in their lives. Sherry threw herself into her work as a fitness instructor, but it was a hollow distraction from the emptiness she felt inside. Matthew, the man who had once seemed like a source of excitement and passion, was now a painful reminder of her mistakes. They had cut ties after the scandal, and Sherry was left to face the consequences of her actions alone. She tried to reach out to Dan to apologize and make amends, but he had closed himself off to her completely. Years passed, and the wounds of the past began to heal, though the scars remained. Dan found a sense of peace in his new life. He had built a successful real estate empire and had even started dating again, though he was cautious, unwilling to risk the kind of pain he had experienced with Sherry. Cameron was thriving, a star player on his high school basketball team, and Dan couldn't have been prouder. Sherry, however, remained trapped in the shadow of her mistakes. She watched from afar as Dan and Cameron built a life without her, their bond stronger than ever. Camila, now a teenager, was more independent, but the distance between her and Sherry never fully closed. Sherry tried to make amends, to show her daughter that she was more than the mistakes she had made, but it was an uphill battle. One evening, as Sherry sat alone in her apartment, she allowed herself to reflect on the life she had lost. She thought about Dan, about the love they had shared and the family they had built. She thought about Cameron and Camila and how her choices had changed their lives forever. The weight of her regret was almost unbearable, but it also gave her a sense of clarity. Sherry realized that she couldn't change the past, but she could choose how to move forward. She began volunteering at a local community center, using her passion for fitness to help others. It was a small step, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She also reached out to Camila, not with apologies or excuses, but with a simple promise to be there for her, no matter what. Dan, meanwhile, found himself reflecting on the life he had shared with Sherry. Though the pain of her betrayal would never fully fade, he began to see her as more than just a woman who had hurt him. She was the mother of his children, the woman he had once loved deeply. He didn't forgive her, but he let go of the anger that had consumed him for so long. In the end, their story was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how easily love can be lost and how hard it is to rebuild what's been broken. Dan moved forward, finding redemption in his relationship with Cameron and his success in business. Sherry, though forever marked by her mistakes, found a glimmer of hope in the possibility of a better future. Their paths had diverged, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. Love, they realized, is fragile, and trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. But even in the face of heartbreak, there is always the possibility of growth, of finding a way to move forward, no matter how heavy the weight of the past.